What's up, everyone? I'm Mintu and welcome back. Today's case is not for the faint-hearted. This is the story of a man who lived in a normal apartment in a normal neighborhood, worked a normal job, and behind his closed door committed crimes so horrifying that the officers who discovered the truth had to receive psychological counseling afterward. This is the story of Jeffrey Dahmer, the Milwaukee monster. So sit back, brace yourself, and let's get into the dark truth. Let's go. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He was the first child of Lionel Dahmer, a chemistry student who would go on to become a research chemist, and Joyce Dahmer, a teletype machine instructor. On the surface, the Dahmer household was an ordinary American family of the early 1960s, a young couple, a new baby, a life being built piece by careful piece in the particular hopeful way of post-war America. But underneath the surface, things were not right. Joyce Dahmer struggled with mental health issues throughout Jeffrey's childhood. She experienced what family members later described as significant anxiety and emotional instability, requiring medication and periodic hospitalization. The household was frequently tense, frequently unpredictable, shaped by the particular atmosphere that mental illness creates when it goes untreated or undertreated in a family environment. The walking on eggshells, the never quite knowing what the day will bring, the absence of the stable emotional ground that children need to develop normally. Lionel Dahmer was often absent, not through cruelty but through the demands of his education and career. He was working toward his chemistry degree, then his career, then the practical requirements of supporting a family. He was not, by his own later account, as present as he should have been. He missed things that, in retrospect, he would spend the rest of his life wondering whether they might have been different if he had seen them sooner. Young Jeffrey was, in his early years, a relatively normal child. He was curious. He was reasonably social. He had friends in the neighborhood, played the games that children played, moved through the early years of his life without attracting particular concern from teachers or neighbors or family members. But there were signs, visible in retrospect, that something was developing in Jeffrey Dahmer that was not developing in other children. He became fascinated with dead animals, not in the casual, naturalistic way that children sometimes are, the picking up of a dead bird to examine it, the brief curiosity of a child encountering mortality for the first time. Jeffrey's interest was different in quality. He collected animal bones. He experimented with the remains of animals he found. He was interested in the inside of things in a way that his father, the chemist, initially interpreted as a scientific curiosity that might be channeled productively. It was not scientific curiosity. It was something else. Something that would grow and develop and eventually consume everything else in Jeffrey Dahmer's interior life until the only thing left was the darkness. By the time he was a teenager, the family had moved to Bath Township, Ohio. His parents' marriage was deteriorating. The years of tension and instability and his mother's health struggles had taken their toll, and the relationship was moving toward its end. When Jeffrey was in high school, his parents divorced. His mother took his younger brother David and moved away. His father moved out temporarily for work. Jeffrey Dahmer was left alone in the family house in Bath Township. 17 years old, alone, and already the things happening inside his mind were becoming impossible to contain. The summer of 1978 was the summer everything changed. Jeffrey Dahmer was 18 years old. He had just graduated from high school. His parents' divorce was finalized. His mother had left with his brother. His father had not yet returned to the house. Jeffrey was alone in the family home in Bath Township, Ohio, with no supervision, no structure, and a mind that had been moving towards something terrible for years. On June 18, 1978, a 19-year-old hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks was walking along a road near Bath Township. He had been to a rock concert and was trying to get home. Jeffrey Dahmer drove past him and offered him a ride. Stephen Hicks accepted. He had no reason not to. Jeffrey Dahmer was 18 years old, clean-cut, apparently normal. A young man offering a ride to another young man on a summer day. Nothing about the interaction, from Stephen's perspective, would have registered as dangerous. They went back to the Dahmer house. They drank beer. They talked. Stephen was friendly, easy company. Jeffrey, by his own later account, did not want Stephen to leave. He had been alone for weeks. The company felt like something he needed, something he didn't want to end. When Stephen said he wanted to go, Jeffrey picked up a barbell and struck him from behind. Stephen Hicks died in the Dahmer house in Bath Township, Ohio, on June 18, 1978. Jeffrey Dahmer was 18 years old. It was his first murder, and what he did afterward, the way he disposed of Stephen's remains, the methodical, almost clinical process he developed over the hours and days that followed, suggested that this was not an act of pure impulse but the expression of something that had been building for a long time and had finally found its outlet. He buried Stephen's remains in the woods behind the house. Later, concerned that the burial site might be discovered, he dug up the remains, dissolved them with acid, and scattered what was left. He had committed a murder and made the victim disappear completely. And then he went on with his life. He enrolled in college. He dropped out after one semester. He joined the army, served for a period, was discharged. He drifted. He worked. He moved to Milwaukee to live with his grandmother. He was arrested for indecent exposure. He was arrested for disorderly conduct. And in 1987, 9 years after Stephen Hicks, he killed again. The Oxford Apartments at 924 North 25th Street in Milwaukee, Wisconsin was not a glamorous address. It was a working-class building in a working-class neighborhood, the kind of place where people lived because the rent was manageable and the location was convenient, not because it was somewhere they had chosen with excitement. The building had thin walls and small rooms, and the particular atmosphere of a place that has housed many people's difficult years. Jeffrey Dahmer moved into apartment 213 in 1990. He was 30 years old. He worked at the Ambrosia Chocolate Factory, a night shift job that gave him his days free and his nights structured. He was quiet. He kept to himself. He occasionally cooked things that produced smells that neighbors found unpleasant, but this was an apartment building, and unpleasant cooking smells are not uncommon in apartment buildings, and people generally do not investigate their neighbors' kitchens. He was, to everyone around him, a quiet, unremarkable man living a quiet, unremarkable life. Between 1987 and 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer murdered 16 more people. They were predominantly young black and brown men, many of them gay, many of them from communities that had complicated relationships with law enforcement, communities where a missing person report did not always receive the same urgent attention that it might receive elsewhere. He lured them to his apartment. He drugged them. He killed them. And then he did things that are almost impossible to write about in plain language. Things that went so far beyond the ordinary grammar of violent crime that investigators who eventually entered apartment 213 struggled to process what they were seeing. He kept remains. He kept photographs. He kept records of what he had done in a way that suggested not the chaotic impulse of someone who had lost control, but the organized, deliberate behavior of someone who was fully present in what they were doing and intended to continue. The smell from apartment 213 was noticed by neighbors. They complained to the building management. Jeffrey told them he had a broken freezer, that meat had spoiled. The explanation was accepted. The police came to his door at least once during this period for a reason that, when it became known, would generate a specific and lasting fury directed at the Milwaukee Police Department. May 27, 1991, a 14-year-old boy named Konerak Sinthasomphone was found by two women on a street near Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment. He was naked. He was disoriented. He was clearly in distress, stumbling, confused, unable to communicate clearly. The women were alarmed. They called 911. Police officers John Balcherzak and Joseph Gabrish arrived on the scene. Jeffrey Dahmer also arrived. He told the officers that the boy was his 19-year-old boyfriend. He said they had been drinking. He said the boy was simply intoxicated and that he would take him home and take care of him. The officers did not check to see whether the boy was who Dahmer said he was. They did not verify his age. They did not contact the missing persons database, where Konerak Sinthasomphone's name appeared. He had been reported missing by his family. They walked Konerak Sinthasomphone back to apartment 213 and left him there with Jeffrey Dahmer. They later called in to the dispatcher and joked about the situation. The recording of that call would later become one of the most damning pieces of evidence in the civil cases that followed, and one of the most cited examples of the ways in which the race and sexuality of victims affected the quality of police response they received. Konerak Sinthasomphone was 14 years old. He was the son of Laotian immigrants. He was one of Dahmer's victims. He died in apartment 213 that night. If the officers had checked, if they had run his name, if they had looked more carefully at the disoriented, naked boy on the street and asked the questions that the situation clearly required, Konerak might have survived. And so might the four people Jeffrey Dahmer killed after him. The two officers were eventually fired. They were later reinstated by an arbitrator. The decision to reinstate them produced outrage in Milwaukee that lasted for years. July 22, 1991, Tracy Edwards was a 32-year-old man who had agreed to go to Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment that night. What happened inside the apartment had frightened him. Dahmer had handcuffed one of his wrists and was behaving in ways that Tracy recognized as dangerous. He had managed to keep himself calm, to talk to Dahmer, to wait for a moment when Dahmer's attention shifted. When that moment came, Tracy Edwards punched Jeffrey Dahmer and ran. He ran out of apartment 213, out of the Oxford Apartments, into the street, still with a handcuff on one wrist, and flagged down a police patrol car. Officers Robert Roth and Rolf Mueller listened to his account and agreed to return to the apartment with him. Jeffrey Dahmer let them in. He was calm. He was cooperative. He offered to get the key for the handcuff from his bedroom. One of the officers went to the bedroom to look for the key. What he saw when he opened the bedroom stopped him completely. Photographs. Polaroid photographs spread across surfaces, showing things that took a moment to process. The human mind sometimes takes a key moment to accept what the eyes are, sending it when what the eyes are. Sending it is something that has no frame of reference in ordinary experience. The officer came back to the main room and told his partner they needed to restrain Dahmer. Dahmer's composure broke. He struggled. He was restrained. The officers then began to search apartment 213. What they found in that apartment is documented in police reports and court records and the accounts of the investigators who were there, and it represents some of the most disturbing crime scene documentation in American law enforcement history. A human head in the refrigerator. More remains in the freezer, skulls, preserved body parts. The Polaroid photographs. a barrel containing remains dissolved in acid. 17 victims accumulated over 13 years, beginning with Stephen Hicks in Bath Township in 1978. The officers who processed that scene received psychological support afterward. Several of them described it as something they never fully recovered from, not in the dramatic sense of being unable to function, but in the quieter sense of carrying something permanently that changes the way you move through the world. Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested in his apartment on July 22, 1991. He did not resist. He was calm. He was cooperative in a way that investigators later described as almost more disturbing than resistance would have been. Jeffrey Dahmer confessed, not reluctantly, not in pieces pulled out through extended interrogation, but in a sustained, detailed account that investigators described as one of the most comprehensive confessions they had ever received from a suspect in a major criminal case. He described each victim. He described what had happened. He described the methods he had used, the timeline of events, the specific details of each crime in a way that was later verified against physical evidence and missing persons records with a high degree of accuracy. He was, by the account of the detectives who sat with him through the confession, coherent, organized, and in many ways remarkably ordinary in his manner of speaking. He did not rant. He did not perform remorse theatrically. He answered questions directly and completely. The detectives who heard the confession described it as a profoundly disorienting experience, sitting across from a man who looked like a man, spoke like a man, engaged with questions like a man, and was describing things that seemed to belong to a different category of reality than the one ordinary human beings inhabit. During the confession and the subsequent legal proceedings, the question of Jeffrey Dahmer's sanity was central. His defense argued that he was suffering from a mental disease or defect that prevented him from conforming his behavior to the requirements of the law. Experts testified on both sides. The jury, after deliberating, rejected the insanity defense. Jeffrey Dahmer was found sane. He was found guilty on 15 counts of murder. One charge was tried separately in Ohio for the murder of Stephen Hicks. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, totaling 957 years in prison. He would serve less than 3. The families of Jeffrey Dahmer's victims are the part of this story that the documentaries and the dramatizations and the true crime podcasts sometimes move past too quickly in their focus on Dahmer himself. There were 17 of them. 17 families who had reported someone missing, or who had simply stopped hearing from someone they loved, and who had spent weeks or months or years in the particular limbo of not knowing, the state of suspended grief that is worse, in many ways, than grief itself, because it offers no closure, no ceremony, no place to put the loss. When the news broke about apartment 213, when the details of what had been found there became public, those families received answers. But the answers were of a kind that no family should ever receive about someone they loved. Many of the victims' families were from communities that had already experienced significant difficulty with the Milwaukee Police Department. The fact that Konerak Sinthasomphone had been returned to Dahmer by officers who did not do their jobs properly. The fact that multiple reports and complaints about Dahmer's apartment and behavior had not been adequately investigated. These were not abstract, institutional failures. They were specific failures that had specific consequences for specific families. The civil lawsuits that followed produced some accountability. The officers involved in the Konerak Sinthasomphone incident were fired, though later reinstated. The city of Milwaukee reached settlements with some of the victims' families, but accountability in civil courts cannot restore what was taken. The names of Jeffrey Dahmer's victims deserve to be said. Stephen Hicks, Stephen Twomey, James Dockstader, Richard Guerrera, Anthony Sears, Ricky Beeks, Edward Smith, Ernest Miller, David Thomas, Curtis Straughter, Errol Lindsay, Konerak Sinthasomphone, Anthony Hughes, Matt Turner, Jeremiah Weinberger, Oliver Lacey, Joseph Braidhoft. 17 people, 17 lives, 17 families. Jeffrey Dahmer was assigned to a work detail at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. On the morning of November 28, 1994, he was beaten to death by a fellow inmate named Christopher Scarver, who also killed another inmate named Jesse Anderson in the same attack. Scarver used a metal bar from the prison gym. Scarver later gave various accounts of his motivations. In one interview, he described Dahmer as someone who provoked other inmates deliberately, who would fashion food in the prison cafeteria into shapes meant to represent body parts and taunt other prisoners with them. Whether this account is fully accurate is difficult to verify, but it has been widely reported. Jeffrey Dahmer was 34 years old when he died. His death produced a complicated public response. There were people who felt that justice had been served, that a man who had taken 17 lives had received a proportionate end. There were others who pointed out that death in prison, however violent, does not constitute a justice system functioning as intended. Lionel Dahmer, Jeffrey's father, had maintained contact with his son throughout the imprisonment. He had written a book attempting to understand how his son had become what he became, a painful, honest, searching account of a father trying to find the place where things went wrong and whether he could have changed them. He received the news of his son's death and issued a statement expressing grief. The grief of a parent for a child who committed monstrous acts is its own category of complicated human experience, one that does not resolve neatly into either condemnation or sympathy. In September 2022, Netflix released a dramatized series called Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story, created by Ryan Murphy and starring Evan Peters as Jeffrey Dahmer. The series became one of the most watched Netflix releases in the platform's history, generating over 1 billion hours of viewing time in its first month. It sparked a renewed global conversation about the Dahmer case, introduced the story to an entirely new generation of viewers, and produced significant controversy. The controversy centered primarily on the families of the victims. Several family members spoke publicly about the series, about being contacted by Netflix during production, or not being contacted, about the ways in which their loved ones were depicted, about the experience of having the most painful events of their lives dramatized for entertainment consumption without their input or consent. Rita Isbell, whose brother Errol Lindsay was one of Dahmer's victims, wrote about watching a scene in which her own victim impact statement, words she had delivered in a courtroom from her own grief, in her own voice, was recreated by an actress. She described the experience of watching someone perform her pain for an audience of millions without anyone having asked her permission or offered her compensation as something that re-traumatized her. The series also placed Glenda Cleveland, a neighbor who had called police multiple times with concerns about Dahmer and had never been adequately heard, at the center of a narrative about institutional failure. The real Glenda Cleveland, who had died in 2011, could not speak for herself. Her daughter spoke on her behalf, expressing complicated feelings about the depiction. The Netflix series raised questions that the true crime genre has been grappling with since its explosion in popularity. What do creators owe to the families of victims? At what point does storytelling about real crimes become exploitation of real suffering? Who benefits from these stories and who pays the cost? These are not questions with simple answers, but they are questions worth asking every time a true crime story is told, including this one. Jeffrey Dahmer killed 17 people over 13 years. He lived in ordinary places. He worked ordinary jobs. He rode the bus. He went to the grocery store. He was, in every visible external feature, a person moving through the world in the unremarkable way that most people move through the world. And in his apartment, behind a closed door, he was doing things that belong to a category of human behavior that most people cannot process without a significant cognitive effort, a deliberate act of imagination required to believe that a human being is capable of what Jeffrey Dahmer was capable of. The case raises questions that criminologists and psychologists and sociologists have been examining for decades. Questions about the development of violent behavior, about the role of childhood environment, about the ways in which social isolation and untreated mental illness interact with whatever is present in a person from the beginning. It also raises questions about systems, about the ways in which certain communities, Black communities, LGBTQ communities, immigrant communities, communities with complicated relationships with law enforcement, are systematically less protected by the institutions that are supposed to protect everyone equally. Most of Dahmer's victims came from these communities. The inadequacy of the police response to reports and concerns about Dahmer, including the catastrophic failure with Konerak Sinthasomphone, was not random. It reflected patterns of institutional bias that had real, fatal consequences for real people. Konerak Sinthasomphone was 14 years old. He was found naked and disoriented on a public street. He was handed back to the man who had taken him there. This is not a footnote to the Dahmer story. It is one of its central chapters. And it is a chapter that the city of Milwaukee and the American law enforcement system more broadly has never fully reckoned with. At Mintu's Dark Truth Files, we tell these stories completely. Not just the parts that are dramatic or shocking, but the parts that are uncomfortable, the institutional failures, the systemic patterns, the ways in which the same crime produces different responses depending on who the victim is. Because the dark truth is not just about the monsters. It is about the systems that allow monsters to continue. Jeffrey Dahmer's 17 victims deserved better. They deserved to be found sooner. They deserved to have their disappearances treated with the same urgency and the same resources that other disappearances receive. They deserve to be alive. Say their names. Stephen, James, Richard, Anthony, Ricky, Edward, Ernest, David, Curtis, Errol, Konerak, Anthony, Matt, Jeremiah, Oliver, Joseph. We remember them. And that was the dark truth behind the Jeffrey Dahmer case. A monster who lived among ordinary people in an ordinary apartment, working an ordinary job, while behind his closed door he committed crimes that still, 30 years later, are almost impossible to fully comprehend. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Subscribe to Mintu's Dark Truth Files so you never miss a case. Drop a comment. What part of this story shocked you the most? I'll see you in the next one. Stay safe out there. And remember, lock your door. Because the dark truth is always closer than you think.